I've never been the type to measure rooms. Most people aren't. But the day I did, I found out my house was hiding something and someone. I bought my first house when I was 31. It wasn't perfect. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a narrow backyard that got almost no sunlight. But it was mine. I'd saved for 6 years, worked overtime I didn't have the energy for, and finally signed the papers in August. The house was in a quiet neighborhood outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. Old trees, wide porches, the kind of street where people still wave from their driveways. The previous owner had passed away. The realtor told me that up front, like she was proud of her transparency. Elderly man lived there alone for decades, died in a hospital, not in the house. She made that part clear too. I didn't care either way. I wasn't superstitious. I was just glad to have a place that was mine. The first 2 weeks were normal. I unpacked slowly, room by room. I painted the hallway. I fixed a leaking faucet in the kitchen. I got used to the sounds old houses make at night, the groaning, the settling, the pipes moving air through them like they're breathing. But there was one thing that had been bothering me since the first walkthrough. The house had a basement. Nothing unusual about that. But from the outside, standing in the backyard, the house looked longer than it did from the inside. I'd noticed it early on and just filed it away as one of those things. The way your eyes play tricks on you with angles and distance. Old houses have strange proportions. I didn't think much of it. Then I started measuring. I don't even know what made me do it. I was assembling a bookshelf one Saturday morning and I had my tape measure out and I just started measuring. The living room, the hallway, the first bedroom, the second, the third. I drew a rough sketch on the back of an envelope. When I added everything up, I was about 14 feet short. I measured again. Same result. 14 feet of the house's footprint were unaccounted for on the interior. I stood in the basement and looked at the far wall, drywall, painted beige. A metal shelf unit pushed against it, loaded with old mason jars the previous owner had left behind. I figured the discrepancy must have been down here. The basement ran the full length of the house, but something felt compressed about it. I moved the shelf unit. It took me 20 minutes because it was heavy and I didn't want to drop the jars. And behind it, I found a door. Not a hidden door, not a clever concealed panel, just a regular hollow core door, the cheap kind, painted over so many times the hinges were almost buried. There was no handle, just a hole where one had been. I stood there looking at it for a long time. I told myself it was a storage room. Old houses have them. Root cellars, coal rooms. It was probably nothing. I pulled the door open with 2 fingers hooked through the handle hole. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. Cement floor, stone walls, no windows. There was a pull-cord light bulb mounted to the ceiling. I reached in and pulled it. The light was dim and yellow, and what it showed me took a long moment to process. There was a cot against the far wall, folded military blanket on top of it, a small wooden table with a surface ringed by water stains from cups set down over years, a shelf built into the wall with canned goods on it, some of them recent enough that I recognized the label design, a 5-gallon water jug almost empty, a bucket in the corner with a fitted lid on it, a battery-powered lantern, and on the table a composition notebook. I stood in the doorway and didn't move for what felt like a full minute. My mind was working through explanations, cycling through them fast. The previous owner used this as a bunker, a panic room, a survival cache. That was logical. That was the kind of thing older people who'd lived through certain eras did. They prepared for the worst. Then I looked at the water jug again, almost empty. I had been in this house for 2 weeks. The house had been vacant for 3 months before I moved in, according to the realtor. A full water jug, properly sealed, would still be mostly full. Somebody had been drinking from it. I picked up the composition notebook. The first 2/3 of it were entries, short, dated, written in a cramped hand. A man writing down his days, meals, whether he'd guessed at from sounds above, references to the schedule and staying quiet during movement. The entries spanned years, many, many years. But then there was a gap and the handwriting changed near the end, shakier. The last few entries were recent, within the last 4 months. The final entry was dated 6 days before I moved in. It said, "New one coming. Need to find somewhere else for a while. I left the house." I didn't grab my keys, didn't grab my phone. I realized that when I was already halfway down the block in my socks on a cold November morning. I went to my neighbor's house, a woman named Patris who I'd spoken to maybe twice, and I knocked on her door until she opened it. The police came. They searched the property for 2 hours. They found the room, they bagged the notebook, they photographed everything. They found a second exit, a tunnel, barely wide enough for a person, that ran under the backyard and opened up into a drainage culvert at the edge of the property. It had been dug out over time and braced with scavenged lumber. They found boot prints in the soil inside it that were fresh. They never found who made them. The detective who interviewed me was thorough and calm and told me they'd follow every lead. He also told me gently that whoever had been living in that room had most likely moved on. That these types of individuals, he used that phrase, these types, typically didn't stay where they felt exposure. I didn't find that comforting. I didn't go back to collect my things. I hired someone. I broke the mortgage contract and ate the financial loss, and I moved into an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a coded front entrance and a doorman. If you've ever moved into an old house and felt like something was just off, like certain spaces didn't add up, you need to hear this before you go any further. I bought my first house when I was 31. It was a 1940s two-story in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes outside of Harrisburg. The kind of place that looks charming in listing photos: wide front porch, hardwood floors, original crown molding. The price was low, even for the area. The previous owner had passed away, an elderly man who'd lived there alone for decades. No family came forward to claim anything. The county handled the estate, cleared out the basics, and put it on the market fast. I didn't ask too many questions. I should have. I moved in on a Friday in October. The days were already getting short. I'd brought enough boxes to fill the downstairs and told myself the rest could wait. That first night I ordered a pizza, sat on the floor of the living room, and convinced myself the uneasy feeling in my chest was just new house nerves. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked. I painted the guest room. I learned which floorboards to avoid at night. Normal stuff. But there was one thing I noticed almost immediately that I couldn't explain. The upstairs hallway was short. Too short. I know how that sounds. But I'm someone who grew up doing renovation work with my dad, and I know how to read a floor plan. The listing showed 4 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a small study. I walked that hallway a dozen times and kept doing the math in my head. There was space unaccounted for, maybe 8, 9 feet, tucked between the back bedroom and the exterior wall. I assumed it was a structural void. Areas closed off during renovations, gaps between walls where insulation was stuffed and forgotten. I told myself that and let it go, until I found the seam. I was painting the back bedroom in early November, the smaller of the two, when I moved the old wooden dresser that had been left behind. It was heavy, solid oak, the kind built to last a century. When I slid it away from the wall, I saw it. A thin vertical line in the drywall, then another parallel to it about 3 feet across, and at the bottom, barely visible beneath layers of old paint, horizontal, a rectangle, a door. My first thought was that it was an old coal chute or a utility access panel, but it was too tall, almost 6 feet, and when I ran my fingers along the seam, I could feel cool air pushing through. Whatever was on the other side of that wall wasn't sealed off. It had airflow. It was a space. I grabbed a utility knife and scored along the seam. The drywall had been patched and painted over multiple times. This had been sealed deliberately, more than once. That should have stopped me. It didn't. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped through. The room was maybe 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep. bare wood floor, no window. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling with a pull chain, and when I reached up and pulled it, it came on. The wiring was still live. I stood there in the yellow light and looked around. Along the left wall there was a wooden shelf, floor to ceiling, with small items on it. Old tin cans, a rusted hand tool I didn't recognize, a pair of leather-work gloves, dry and cracked, normal enough, old storage. But on the right wall there was a chair, a simple wooden chair facing the wall, and on the wall in front of it, at eye level for someone seated, there were names, not carved, written, in what looked like pencil or charcoal in small, careful handwriting. A list. First names only, maybe 20 of them, going down the wall in two neat columns, some with dates next to them, some without. I didn't recognize any of them. I photographed everything with my phone and backed out of the room. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I drove to the county record's office and started asking questions. The man who'd owned the house before me, his name was Gerald. He'd lived there from 1974 until he died. Before him, the house had passed through 3 other owners in the post-war years, all relatively short stays. But what I found in the deed records made everything heavier. Gerald had a brother who'd lived with him in the early years at the property. The brother had left, or at least, that's what the records suggested. A forwarding address filed once in 1979, and then nothing. No death certificate in the county. No paper trail after that single document. I took the photos to the local sheriff's office. They sent a deputy out to look at the room. The deputy took it seriously enough to file a report and pass the photos up the chain. Investigators came the following week. They pulled the floors, checked the crawlspace, searched the property. They didn't find anything. Not definitively. But one of the investigators, an older man who'd been doing this for a long time, he pulled me aside before they left and said something that has stayed with me since. He said the names on the wall didn't match anyone in their missing persons database, but that doesn't mean they weren't missing. It just means no one filed a report. Some people disappear and nobody notices. Nobody looks. Nobody files paperwork. They're just gone, and somewhere, maybe in a room that nobody was supposed to find, someone remembered them. I sold the house 4 months later. Took a loss. I don't regret it for a single second. Have you ever moved into a place that felt just a little too perfect? Like whoever lived there before you left in a hurry and didn't want you to know why? That's exactly how I felt about that house. I found it on a rental listing in early November. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, decent yard, and the price was almost insultingly low for the area. The landlord told me the previous tenant had broken the lease and left without explanation. He said it like it was no big deal, like people just walk away from their homes all the time. I told myself it was my lucky break. I moved in on a Saturday, spent the first 2 days unpacking, figuring out which light switches did what, learning the sounds of the house. Every old house has its own sounds. The way the pipes knock when the heat kicks on. The way certain floorboards groan depending on where you step. I cataloged all of it in my head, the way you do when you want a place to start feeling like home. By the 3rd night, I was settled enough to actually sleep. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint trace of something damp and closed off. I assumed it was the basement. Old houses get that way. I sprayed some air freshener, cracked a window, and didn't think much more about it. But the smell kept coming back. And over the next few days, I started to realize it wasn't coming from the basement at all. It was stronger in the upstairs hallway, specifically near the end of the hall between the linen closet and the 3rd bedroom. I stood there one afternoon, pressing my nose almost against the wall like an idiot, trying to figure out what was behind it. The wall was solid drywall. Painted over so many times, the surface had this thick, almost waxy texture. Nothing unusual, no door, no vent, just wall, but the smell was absolutely coming from the other side of it. I knocked on the wall inside the bedroom. Solid. I knocked on the hallway wall. Hollow. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Older homes have dead spaces all the time. Insulation gaps, old chimney shafts, sealed off areas from renovations. Nothing sinister, just bad architecture. But the smell kept pulling at me. And now curiosity had its hooks in too deep for me to just walk away. I got a utility knife from my toolbox, found a spot low on the hallway wall where any damage would be least visible, and cut a small test line through the drywall. The smell hit me immediately, thick, stale, and laced with something I couldn't name. Chemical, almost, like industrial cleaning product mixed with something older underneath it. I cut a larger section away, enough to shine a flashlight through. The beam landed on a concrete floor, bare walls, a ceiling about 7 feet high, and a steel folding chair sitting in the center of the space facing away from me. I stopped breathing. There was no other furniture, no boxes, no storage, nothing to indicate the space had any practical purpose at all, just a concrete room, a chair, and that smell. I should have called the landlord right then, or the police, or literally anyone else. Instead, I cut the opening wider and pushed myself through. The walls were concrete block, not drywall, and they looked recent, newer than the rest of the house. One of the walls had faint rectangular marks on it where something had been mounted and removed. Bolts still in the concrete, cut down flush to the surface. 4 of them, evenly spaced, at about shoulder height. I stood there staring at those bolts for a long time. I looked at the chair again. It was positioned deliberately, precisely centered in the room. The legs had left small circular indentations in the concrete from sitting in the same spot for a long time. And when I crouched down to look closer, I saw that the floor around the base of the chair had been cleaned. Obsessively. The kind of clean that stands out. Like someone had scrubbed a particular area so many times the concrete had a different texture there than anywhere else. I didn't touch anything. I backed out of that opening and sat in the hallway with my back against the opposite wall for probably 10 minutes, not moving. Then I called the landlord. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd found. There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. And then he said, very carefully, that he didn't know anything about that room, that the previous tenant must have done some unauthorized construction, that he'd look into it. I asked him when the previous tenant had moved in. He said 3 years ago. I asked him why someone would need 3 years to build a concrete room inside a wall. He didn't have an answer for that. I was out of that house within 2 hours. I packed only what I needed for a week and drove to my brother's place in the next town over. I filed a report with the local police department the next morning. I told them everything, gave them the address, described the room, described the bolts, described the scrubbed floor. They looked into it. I got a call about a week later. The officer told me they hadn't found evidence of a specific crime, but that the room had been flagged and the property was being investigated further. He used the word irregular 3 times during that call. He told me I was smart to leave. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't push for more. I don't know what happened in that room. I've told myself 100 different explanations. Some innocent, most not. I think about the person who lived there for 3 years. I think about what they were doing every single night while the neighbors waved from driveways and checked their mailboxes and lived their normal lives 20 feet away. And I think about the fact that he's still out there. Wherever he is now, he's still out there. If any of these stories got under your skin, you're not alone. Drop a comment below and tell me which one messed with you the most. I read every single one. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you've got a story of your own, something that actually happened to you or someone you know, send it in the comments. Stay safe out there.